Imagine a ship so revolutionary that it could sail against the wind, a vessel so advanced that it allowed a country smaller than the state of Indiana to conquer half the known world. In the 15th century, while other nations hugged coastlines in fear, Portuguese sailors were crossing oceans, discovering new continents, and building the first global empire in human history. The weapon that made this possible wasn't a sword, a cannon, or an army. It was a ship called the Caravel. And today, I'm going to reveal the engineering secrets that made Portugal unstoppable on the high seas. But before we dive into this incredible story, if you love history, engineering, and the stories of how technology changed the world, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's unlock the secret of the Caravels. Let me take you back to the early 1400s. Europe was trapped. I know that sounds dramatic, but it's true. The Mediterranean Sea was controlled by Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa, who had a stranglehold on trade routes to Asia. The land routes, those were even worse, controlled by the Ottoman Empire, which meant Europeans had to pay outrageous prices for spices, silk, and other luxury goods from the east. Portugal found itself in a particularly difficult position. Located on the western edge of Europe, with Spain blocking access to the Mediterranean, Portuguese merchants were cut off from the profitable eastern trade. The Atlantic Ocean loomed to the west, vast and terrifying, largely unexplored, and considered by many to be unnavigable. But here's where it gets interesting. The ships that existed at the time were completely inadequate for ocean exploration. The heavy, square-rigged vessels used in northern Europe, like cogs and hulks, were sturdy enough for coastal trading, but couldn't sail efficiently against the wind. They were at the mercy of prevailing winds and currents. If you sailed south along the African coast, you might make it down, but getting back was nearly impossible with these ships. Mediterranean galleys, on the other hand, were fast and maneuverable, but required dozens of rowers and couldn't carry enough supplies for long ocean voyages. They were coastal vessels, never meant for the open Atlantic. The Vikings had their longships, which could cross oceans, but these were essentially overgrown rowboats, totally impractical for carrying cargo or establishing trade routes. So Portugal faced a technological wall. They needed to find a sea route to Asia by sailing around Africa, but they didn't have ships capable of making the journey. The problem wasn't just about going somewhere, it was about coming back. This is crucial. You could theoretically sail south with the prevailing northerly winds, but how would you return home against those same winds? This challenge consumed the Portuguese for decades. Prince Henry, who history remembers as the Navigator, became obsessed with solving this problem. He established a centre for maritime innovation at Sagres, on the southwestern tip of Portugal, where he gathered the best shipwrights, sailors, cartographers, and navigators he could find. He poured resources into understanding winds, currents, and ship design. The economic pressure was immense. Portugal was a poor country with few natural resources. Its population was tiny compared to the great powers of Europe. But Portugal had one major advantage: a long coastline and a maritime tradition. Fishing and coastal trading had been the lifeblood of Portuguese communities for centuries. If Portugal could crack the code of oceanic navigation, it could bypass its neighbours entirely and access the riches of Africa and Asia directly. Between 1415 and 1434, Portuguese expeditions made repeated attempts to push south along the African coast. Each time they reached roughly the same point, Cape Bojador, in present-day Western Sahara. This windswept cape became a psychological and technological barrier. Sailors feared the strong currents and the difficulty of returning north. Ships that made it past Cape Bojador often couldn't make it home, and many sailors believed the ocean beyond was filled with sea monsters and boiling waters. In 1434, one of Prince Henry's captains, Gil Eanes, finally rounded Cape Bojador and returned to tell the tale. But he only managed this because of experimental modifications to his ship's design, incorporating features that would soon define the Caravel. This breakthrough proved that with the right vessel, Portuguese sailors could push further into the unknown and, more importantly, make it back home. The stage was set for a revolution in ship design. The Caravel would be Portugal's answer to an impossible problem, and it would change the course of world history. Now let's get into the heart of what made the Caravel so special. When I first learned about these ships, I was struck by how every element of their design was purpose-built to solve a specific problem. This wasn't a ship that evolved gradually over centuries. The Caravel was an intentional, revolutionary design that combined innovations from multiple maritime traditions into something entirely new. The first thing you notice about a Caravel is its size, or rather, its lack of size. These ships were small, typically between 50 and 70 feet long, with a beam width of about 20 feet. Compare this to the massive carracks that would come later, which could be 3 times as large, or the enormous galleons of the Spanish Armada. The Caravel looked almost fragile by comparison, but this small size was a deliberate choice and a stroke of genius. A smaller ship required a smaller crew, typically just 20 to 30 men, which meant fewer mouths to feed and less space needed for provisions. This might not sound revolutionary until you realize that feeding a crew was one of the biggest limitations on voyage length. With a small crew, a Caravel could stay at sea for weeks or even months longer than larger vessels. The hull design was equally innovative. Caravels featured a Caravels-built hull, where the planks were laid edge to edge rather than overlapping like in clinker-built ships common in Northern Europe. This created a smooth hull surface that reduced drag and made the ship faster through the water. The hull was also relatively shallow, with a draft of only 6 to 8 feet, allowing Caravels to explore coastal waters, navigate rivers, and approach beaches that deeper draft ships couldn't reach. The shape of the hull was crucial too. Caravels had a relatively narrow beam compared to their length, giving them a length-to-beam ratio that made them fast and agile. The bow was sharply raked, cutting through waves rather than riding over them, which improved speed and reduced the pounding that crews experienced in rough seas. The stern was typically rounded or slightly squared, depending on the specific type of Caravel. Here's something most people don't realize. There were actually 2 main types of Caravels. The Caravel Latina had purely Latin sails, which I'll talk about in detail in the next section. These were incredibly maneuverable and could sail closer to the wind than any other vessel of the time. However, they required skilled crew work to handle the complex rigging. The Caravel Redonda, developed slightly later, incorporated a mix of square and lateen sails. The mainmast and foremast carried square sails for running before the wind, while the mizzenmast retained a lateen sail for maneuverability. This hybrid design gave captains the best of both worlds: speed when sailing downwind and agility when tacking against the wind or sailing in coastal waters. The deck layout was also carefully planned. Unlike the towering castles at bow and stern that characterized many medieval ships, Caravels had low, streamlined superstructures. This reduced wind resistance and improved stability. The main deck was largely open, making it easier to handle cargo and work the sails. Below deck was a small hold for provisions and trade goods, plus cramped quarters for the crew. One of the most important but often overlooked features was the Caravel's rudder. Portuguese shipwrights developed a stern-post-mounted rudder that was larger and more effective than previous designs. This rudder, combined with the ship's hull shape and sail plan, gave captains unprecedented control over their vessel's direction. They could execute sharp turns, hold a steady course in challenging conditions, and respond quickly to changing winds. The construction techniques were also advanced for their time. Portuguese shipwrights used mathematical principles to design hulls ensuring symmetry and proper proportions. They selected woods carefully, using pine for planking because it was lightweight and resistant to rot, and oak for the keel and structural members because of its strength. The ships were built in specially designed shipyards where workers specialized in different aspects of construction, creating a proto-assembly line system that improved quality and consistency. What really amazes me about the Caravels design is how well the different elements work together as a system. The small size enabled long voyages, the shallow draft enabled coastal exploration, the hull shape enabled speed and seaworthiness, the sail plan enabled sailing against the wind, and all of these features combined to create a vessel that was far more capable than the sum of its parts. This revolutionary design didn't emerge fully formed overnight. It evolved through trial and error, incorporating lessons learned from each voyage. Prince Henry's Maritime Centre became a kind of laboratory where shipwrights could experiment with different configurations, test new ideas, and refine their designs based on feedback from sailors who'd actually used the ships at sea. By the 1440s, the caravel design had matured into a vessel unlike anything else on the water. Portuguese sailors now had a tool that could take them anywhere in the world, and more importantly, bring them home again. The age of exploration was about to explode, and the caravel would be at the center of every major discovery. Let me tell you about the single most important innovation that made caravels revolutionary: the lateen sail. If you've ever seen pictures of traditional Arabic dhows or Mediterranean fishing boats, you've seen lateen sails. These are the distinctive triangular sails hung at an angle from a long yard arm. But here's what most people miss. Incorporating lateen sails into Atlantic ship design was a breakthrough that fundamentally changed what was possible at sea. To understand why this matters, I need to explain how sailing actually works. Square sails, which were standard on most European ships, are essentially vertical curtains of canvas hung perpendicular to the ship. They're excellent when the wind is coming from behind, pushing you forward. You can sail fast with square sails in favorable winds, but they're terrible when you need to sail toward the direction the wind is coming from. With purely square-rigged ships, you were basically stuck going wherever the wind wanted to take you. Lateen sails changed everything. The triangular shape and the angled positioning create a vertical airfoil, similar to an airplane wing. When wind hits a lateen sail, it creates a difference in air pressure between the two sides of the sail, generating forward thrust even when the wind is coming from an angle. This means you can sail much closer to the wind direction, typically within 45 to 55 degrees of where the wind is coming from. Why does this matter? It means you're no longer a prisoner of the wind. You can zigzag upwind through a technique called tacking, where you sail at an angle to the wind, then turn and sail at the opposite angle, gradually making progress toward your destination even if the wind is blowing directly from there. This capability was absolutely revolutionary for exploration. Think about the problem Portuguese sailors faced sailing down the African coast. The prevailing winds along the West African coast blow from north to south. Easy sailing going down, impossible sailing coming back if you only have square sails. But with lateen sails, you could tack your way back north, using the very same winds that had carried you south. This single innovation made round-trip exploration voyages possible. The Portuguese didn't invent lateen sails. These sails had been used in the Mediterranean for centuries, probably introduced by Arab traders. In fact, the word lateen comes from Latin, referring to the Latin-speaking Mediterranean cultures that used them. What the Portuguese did was adapt this Mediterranean technology for Atlantic conditions and combine it with hull designs that could handle ocean swells and storms. Rigging a lateen sail is complex. The yard arm, which can be as long as the ship itself, must be attached to the mast at an angle and controlled by a sophisticated system of lines and tackles. To tack the ship, changing the sail from one side to the other requires careful coordination by the crew. The long yard arm has to swing around the mast, a maneuver that could be dangerous in rough seas or high winds. It required skilled sailors who understood the mechanics and could work together precisely, but the performance advantages were worth the complexity. Contemporary accounts describe how caravels could sail circles around heavier square-rigged vessels. They could maneuver in and out of harbours without needing to wait for favourable winds. They could explore coastlines, sailing north one day and south the next, regardless of wind direction. They could escape from danger by sailing in directions that pursuing ships couldn't follow. There's another advantage of lateen sails that's less obvious but equally important. They perform well in lighter winds. Square sails need a good stiff breeze to fill properly and generate thrust. Lateen sails can catch and use lighter winds more efficiently, keeping the ship moving even when conditions are calm. This was crucial for exploration because it meant fewer days sitting becalmed, waiting for wind. The Portuguese experimented extensively with different sail configurations. Some caravels used 2 lateen sails, one on the mainmast and one on the mizzen. Others used 3 or even 4 masts as ships grew larger. The development of the caravel redonda, mixing square and lateen sails, was an attempt to optimize performance across different sailing conditions. Square sails for speed when running downwind, lateen sails for agility and upwind capability. Mastering lateen sail handling became a key skill for Portuguese sailors. Training programs at Prince Henry's Navigation School included extensive practice in handling these complex rigs. Portuguese sailors became renowned throughout Europe for their sailing skills, and much of that reputation was built on their expertise with lateen sails. The impact of this technology rippled far beyond Portugal. As news of Portuguese successes spread, other European nations began adopting lateen sails for their own vessels. The evolution of ship design through the 15th and 16th centuries shows increasing sophistication in mixing square and lateen sails to optimize performance. By the time of Columbus's voyage to the Americas, even the Santa Maria and her sister ships incorporated lateen sails, though they were primarily square-rigged. But Portugal maintained an advantage because they'd been perfecting this technology longer than anyone else. Their sailors had decades of experience. Their shipwrights understood the subtle details of how to proportion masts, size yards, and configure rigging for optimal performance. This experiential knowledge, passed from master to apprentice in Portuguese shipyards, was nearly impossible for other nations to replicate quickly. The lateen sail was more than just a piece of technology. It was the key that unlocked the world's oceans, transforming sailing from an exercise in hoping the wind cooperated into a reliable means of going wherever you needed to go. Without lateen sails, the caravel would have been just another coastal vessel. With them, it became the most capable exploration ship the world had ever seen. Now I want to address something that seems almost impossible when you first learn about it. How did Portugal, a tiny nation on the edge of Europe, become the world's first global naval superpower? When I say tiny, I mean it. Portugal, in the 15th century, had a population of maybe 1 million people. Compare that to France with 15 million, or Spain with 7 million. In terms of land area, Portugal was, and still is, one of Europe's smallest countries. So how did they punch so far above their weight? The answer is a combination of geography, necessity, timing, and brilliant leadership. Let's start with geography. Portugal occupies the western coast of the Iberian Peninsula, facing directly onto the Atlantic Ocean. While this made Portugal isolated from the rest of Europe in some ways, it also meant Portuguese communities had been living from the sea for generations. Fishing, coastal trading, and boat building were deeply embedded in the culture. Every coastal town had men who understood winds, currents, and seamanship. This maritime tradition gave Portugal a foundation that landlocked nations couldn't match. When Prince Henry began his navigation program, he didn't have to create a maritime culture from scratch. He was amplifying and directing something that already existed. Portuguese sailors were already skilled. Portuguese shipwrights already knew their craft. Henry's genius was organizing this diffuse knowledge into a focused effort. Necessity was another crucial factor. Portugal had no choice but to look to the sea. Blocked by Spain from expanding eastward into Europe, lacking the agricultural resources of the continental powers, and shut out of Mediterranean trade routes, Portugal needed an alternative path to prosperity. The Atlantic offered that path, but only if they could develop the technology and knowledge to exploit it. This desperation created focus and determination. The timing was also perfect in a historical sense. The 15th century was a period when several technologies and knowledge systems were converging in ways that made ocean exploration feasible. The compass had been introduced to Europe from China. Astrolabes and other navigation instruments were being refined. Cartography was improving. Gunpowder weapons were becoming more effective. Portugal was positioned to synthesize these elements into a coherent system. But I think the real secret of Portugal's success was the organizational structure that Prince Henry created. He essentially established history's first research and development program, though nobody called it that at the time. At his facility in Sagres, he brought together experts from across Europe and beyond. There were Jewish mathematicians who understood astronomy and navigation, Arab sailors who knew the African coast, Italian map makers with the latest cartographic techniques, German metallurgists who could cast better cannons. This was revolutionary for the time. Knowledge in medieval Europe was fragmented and often kept secret by guilds and craftsmen who feared competition. Henry created an environment where knowledge was shared, discussed, and improved. Ship captains returning from voyages debriefed with cartographers to update maps. Shipwrights consulted with sailors about design improvements. Astronomers worked with navigators to develop better techniques for determining latitude. Henry also established a systematic approach to exploration. Rather than launching random expeditions, hoping for lucky discoveries, he set incremental goals. Push a little further down the African coast each voyage. Map what you find. Bring back information about winds, currents, and coastlines. Each expedition built on the knowledge gained from the previous one. This methodical approach compounded knowledge rapidly. The economics were carefully managed too. Henry understood that exploration needed to be self-sustaining. Early voyages brought back trade goods, fish, seal skins, and eventually African gold and slaves. These profits funded further expeditions. As Portuguese ships pushed further south, they established trading posts that generated ongoing revenue. By the time Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India in 1498, Portuguese trading networks along the African coast were already highly profitable. Portugal also benefited from what we might call first-mover advantage, because they started seriously exploring decades before other European nations. They accumulated knowledge that others lacked. Portuguese charts showing winds and currents along the African coast were state secrets, extremely valuable because they told sailors the safe routes. Portuguese pilots who understood these routes could command high fees. When other nations finally began their own exploration programs, they were decades behind in knowledge and experience. The Portuguese crown made strategic use of monopolies and patents. The king granted certain individuals or groups exclusive rights to trade with particular regions or to explore specific areas. This created incentives for private investment in exploration while ensuring the crown received its share of profits through taxation. It was an early form of public-private partnership that mobilized resources beyond what the government could fund alone. Military power was also important. As caravels evolved, the Portuguese armed them with cannons, creating the world's first effective naval artillery platforms. This gave Portuguese trading posts the ability to defend themselves and allowed Portuguese ships to intimidate or destroy competitors. The combination of superior ships, skilled sailors, and effective weaponry meant Portugal could project power far beyond what its small population would suggest. There was also a cultural element, success built on success. As Portuguese explorers achieved remarkable feats, it created national pride and ambition. Young men wanted to become explorers, investors wanted to fund voyages. The Crown committed more resources. Portugal entered a virtuous cycle where success generated the resources and motivation for more success. Religious motivation can't be ignored either. The Portuguese saw themselves as crusaders carrying Christianity to new lands. Prince Henry was a deeply religious man who viewed exploration partly as a spiritual mission. This religious framing helped justify the enormous expenses and risks, and it provided an additional motivation beyond mere profit. By the 1480s, Portugal had established the world's most sophisticated maritime infrastructure. They had the best ships, the best sailors, the most accurate charts, the most effective navigation techniques, and a network of trading posts stretching along the African coast. When Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, and when Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, these weren't lucky accidents. They were the culmination of decades of systematic effort. The small nation on the edge of Europe had transformed itself into a global power through intelligence, determination, and technological innovation. For a brief but remarkable period, Portugal controlled the sea routes to Africa, India, and eventually Brazil and parts of Asia. The tiny kingdom had become an empire on which the sun never set, all because they figured out how to build ships that could go anywhere in the world. Let me walk you through the incredible voyages that caravels made possible. These weren't just trips. They were journeys into the complete unknown, where every mile sailed was a mile farther than any European had gone before. The caravel was the vehicle that enabled these discoveries, and understanding what these ships actually accomplished helps you appreciate why they were so revolutionary. Let's start with the exploration of the African coast, which was the proving ground for caravels. After Guillen's rounded Cape Bojador in 1434, subsequent expeditions pushed steadily southward. In 1441, Nuno Tristão reached Cape Blanc in present-day Mauritania. In 1444, Dinis Dias reached the mouth of the Senegal River. In 1456, Alvise Cadamosto, a Venetian in Portuguese service, reached the Cape Verde Islands. Each of these expeditions relied on caravels. The ship's ability to sail upwind meant explorers could venture far from home, knowing they could get back. The shallow draft meant they could explore rivers and coastal areas. The small crew size meant they could stay at sea for months. Every year, Portuguese caravels pushed the boundary of known world a little further south. In 1488 came one of history's most important voyages. Bartolomeu Dias set sail with 3 ships, including 2 caravels, to push beyond the furthest point yet reached on the African coast. After months of sailing south along the African coast, Dias's expedition was blown offshore by a storm. When they finally made landfall again, they realized they were on the east coast of Africa. They had rounded the southern tip of the continent without even seeing it. Dias called the southern cape the Cape of Storms, though King John II later renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, recognizing that a route to India was now open. Dias's success set the stage for Vasco da Gama's epic voyage a decade later. In 1497, da Gama led a fleet of 4 ships, including caravels, from Lisbon to India. This voyage covered approximately 24,000 miles round trip and took over 2 years. They sailed down the African coast, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, sailed up the eastern African coast to Malindi in present-day Kenya, then struck out across the Indian Ocean to Calicut in India. Think about what this meant. For the first time, Europeans had reached Asia by sea, opening a direct trade route that bypassed the Mediterranean and Ottoman-controlled land routes entirely. This voyage changed the economic geography of the world. The caravels that made this journey weren't just ships. They were the vehicles of a revolution in global trade. But Portuguese caravels didn't just explore Africa. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral led a fleet that was officially headed to India but swung far west in the Atlantic, possibly deliberately, and made landfall in what is now Brazil. This discovery, indigenous peoples had been there for thousands of years, of course, gave Portugal a claim to South America under the Treaty of Tordesillas. Once again, caravels had expanded Portuguese territory and influence. Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Americas also involved caravels, though Columbus was sailing for Spain, not Portugal. The Niña and the Pinta were both caravels, while the Santa Maria was a larger carrack. Columbus chose these ships precisely because caravels had proven themselves in Portuguese service. The vessels that made arguably the most famous voyage in history were direct descendants of Portuguese maritime technology. Portuguese caravels also pioneered routes across the Indian Ocean, establishing trading posts and forts in India, Ceylon, the Spice Islands, and eventually reaching as far as China and Japan. The caravel Flor de la Mar became famous for its role in Portuguese campaigns in Southeast Asia, though it eventually sank carrying a fortune in treasure. What's remarkable about all these voyages is how routinely caravels handled conditions that would have been impossible for earlier ships. They crossed the doldrums near the equator, where winds are light and variable. They navigated the powerful currents around the Cape of Good Hope. They survived the monsoons of the Indian Ocean. They explored thousands of miles of unknown coastline. The information gathered on these voyages was equally important as the physical discoveries. Portuguese captains compiled detailed logs noting winds, currents, landmarks, safe anchorages, sources of fresh water, and potential dangers. This information was compiled into rutters, essentially sailing guides that told future navigators what to expect and how to handle different conditions. These rutters were state secrets, carefully guarded by the Portuguese crown. Caravels also served as floating laboratories where new navigation techniques were developed and tested. Portuguese navigators refined the use of the astrolabe for measuring latitude. They developed tables showing the sun's position at different latitudes throughout the year, making it easier to determine position. They created increasingly accurate charts, showing coastlines, currents, and wind patterns. The psychological impact of these voyages shouldn't be underestimated either. Before Portuguese caravels proved otherwise, most Europeans believed the oceans were too vast and dangerous for reliable navigation. Ancient fears about sea monsters, boiling waters near the equator, and impassable zones persisted. Every successful caravel voyage chipped away at these superstitions, replacing fear with knowledge. By the early 1500s, caravels had fundamentally redrawn the world map. Coastlines that had been blank or filled with mythical creatures were now accurately charted. Trade routes that had taken months overland could now be sailed in weeks. European powers suddenly had access to spices, silk, gems, and other valuable goods without having to deal with dozens of middlemen. The economic implications were staggering, but perhaps the most important role caravels played was demonstrating that the world was knowable and navigable. They proved that human beings with the right tools and knowledge could go anywhere on Earth and return to tell the tale. This confidence, this sense that the world was open to exploration, fundamentally changed European consciousness and set the stage for the age of colonialism and globalization that followed. The caravel wasn't just a vehicle for discovery, it was the tool that transformed our species' relationship with the planet, connecting continents and cultures that had been separate for millennia. For better and worse, the world would never be the same. Now let's talk about something that often gets overlooked when people discuss caravels. These weren't just exploration vessels. They were also highly effective warships, and the military innovations incorporated into caravel design gave Portugal a decisive advantage in naval combat that lasted for decades. The key innovation was mounting cannons on relatively small, maneuverable ships. This might not sound like a big deal today, but in the early 15th century, it was revolutionary. Large cannons existed, but they were primarily siege weapons used to attack fortifications on land. Naval warfare at the time was still largely medieval. Ships would close with each other. Sailors would fire arrows and crossbow bolts, then board the enemy vessel for hand-to-hand combat. The Portuguese were among the first to recognize that cannons mounted on ships could fundamentally change naval warfare. But there was a problem. Cannons are heavy. Mount too many heavy cannons on a ship, and you make it unstable and slow. The genius of the caravel design was that its hull structure could support cannons while remaining fast and maneuverable. Early caravels mounted relatively light cannons called falconets and swivel guns, which fired small shot and were designed primarily to repel boarders and damage an enemy ship's rigging and crew. These were mounted on the gunwales or on swiveling posts that allowed them to be aimed quickly. As metallurgy improved and cannon design became more sophisticated, later caravels mounted heavier weapons capable of actually damaging enemy hulls. The tactical advantages were enormous. A caravel could stand off from an enemy vessel and pummel it with cannon fire, while using its superior maneuverability to avoid being boarded. Against the dhows and trading vessels of the Indian Ocean, which typically had no artillery at all, Portuguese caravels were devastatingly effective. A single caravel could dominate an entire harbour. The Portuguese developed specific tactics for naval combat that exploited the caravel's capabilities. They would approach enemy ships from windward, where their ability to sail close to the wind gave them a manoeuvring advantage. They would use their cannons to disable enemy ships by targeting masts and rigging, then close for boarding only after the enemy was already crippled. Against coastal fortifications, caravels could use their shallow draft to get close inshore, bombard the defences, and withdraw before effective counterfire could be organized. The psychological impact of this new form of warfare was significant. Cultures that had dominated maritime trade in the Indian Ocean for centuries suddenly found themselves outmatched by these strange ships from the far west. The combination of artillery, maneuverability, and disciplined crews made Portuguese caravels seem almost invincible. Portuguese commanders also understood combined arms tactics. Larger expeditions would include a mix of caravels and larger carracks. The caravels would serve as scouts, fast raiders, and escorts, while the heavier carracks would carry the bulk of trade goods and troops. This combination of speed and firepower made Portuguese fleets extremely effective. The famous Portuguese admiral Afonso de Albuquerque used caravels brilliantly in his campaigns to establish Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean. At the Battle of Diu in 1509, a small Portuguese fleet that included several caravels defeated a much larger combined fleet of Egyptian, Gujarati, and Ottoman ships. The Portuguese vessels' superior artillery and maneuverability won the day against overwhelming numbers. Caravels also served effectively in amphibious operations. Their shallow draft meant they could land troops directly on beaches without needing intermediate boats. Armed caravels could provide covering fire during landings. Small squads of caravels could raid enemy coastlines, capturing or burning enemy vessels, seizing supplies, and spreading fear. The Portuguese maintained their artillery advantage for decades through careful attention to metallurgy and gun founding. Portuguese cannons were among the best in the world, cast from high-quality bronze using techniques refined through continuous experimentation. They were more reliable, more accurate, and more durable than the guns other nations could produce. Training was another advantage. Portuguese gun crews practiced extensively, making them more effective in combat. They understood how to compensate for the ship's motion when aiming. They could load and fire faster than typical crews. They knew which types of shot to use against different targets. This expertise, combined with superior equipment, made Portuguese caravels punch far above their weight in combat. The fortified trading posts that Portugal established around the world relied heavily on caravels for defense and resupply. These posts were essentially small forts that could hold out against local forces, but needed regular shipments of gunpowder, weapons, supplies, and reinforcements from Portugal. Caravels were ideal for this role, fast enough to evade pirates or hostile ships, armed enough to fight if necessary, and capable of carrying essential supplies. There's a darker side to this military effectiveness that has to be acknowledged. The same capabilities that made caravels excellent exploration vessels also made them effective for less noble purposes. Portuguese ships were heavily involved in the slave trade, raiding African coastal communities and transporting enslaved people across the Atlantic. The caravel's speed and firepower made it an efficient tool for this horrific trade. In terms of pure military technology, the armed caravel represented a revolution in naval warfare comparable to the introduction of the steam engine or the aircraft carrier in later centuries. It demonstrated that smaller, faster, more maneuverable ships with effective artillery could defeat larger vessels and project power across vast distances. This lesson would shape naval architecture and tactics for centuries to come. The evolution from the purely exploratory early caravels to the armed merchant raiders of the early 1500s shows how quickly military applications developed. Within just a few decades, caravels went from being primarily exploration vessels that might carry a few small cannons for self-defense to being formidable warships that could challenge enemy fleets and bombard fortifications. Other European nations took notice and began developing their own versions of armed sailing ships, but Portugal maintained its lead for a generation or more. The combination of superior ship design, better artillery, more skilled crews, and decades of practical experience gave Portuguese caravels a decisive edge that allowed a tiny nation to dominate the world's oceans. Let me take you inside one of history's most important but least understood institutions, the shipyards and maritime centre that Prince Henry the Navigator established in Portugal. This wasn't just a place where ships were built. It was the world's first systematic centre for maritime research and development, and understanding how it worked helps explain why Portugal succeeded where other nations failed. Prince Henry, despite his nickname, probably never navigated a ship himself. He was the third son of King John I of Portugal, born in 1394, and he devoted his life to organizing and funding maritime exploration. After distinguishing himself in the Portuguese capture of Ceuta in North Africa in 1415, Henry became obsessed with the idea of reaching the source of African gold and finding a sea route to Asia. In 1419, Henry was appointed governor of the Algarve, Portugal's southernmost province, and he established his base at Sagres, near Cape St. Vincent, the southwestern tip of Europe. This location was significant. It was as far west as you could get in Portugal, jutting out into the Atlantic, surrounded by the ocean on three sides. It was the perfect place to study the Atlantic and train sailors for oceanic voyages. What Henry built at Sagres was revolutionary. He established shipyards where the latest designs could be constructed and tested. He created a school of navigation where pilots could be trained. He assembled libraries of charts, maps, and sailing directions. He brought together experts from across Europe and beyond, Shipwrights from Genoa, astronomers from Germany, Jewish mathematicians, Arab navigators who knew the African coast, anyone with knowledge that could advance his program. The shipyards themselves were state-of-the-art facilities for the time. Portuguese shipwrights developed specialized techniques for caravel construction. They understood that building these vessels required precision. The hull had to be properly shaped to achieve the right hydrodynamic properties. The masts had to be positioned correctly to balance the sail plan. The rudder had to be sized appropriately for responsive handling. Wood selection was a science in itself. Different woods were used for different parts of the ship based on their properties. Pine was preferred for planking because it was relatively lightweight, easy to work, and naturally resistant to rot. Oak was used for the keel, frames, and other structural members that needed maximum strength. Masts were typically made from tall, straight pine or fir trees. Shipwrights would personally select trees, sometimes marking specific trees years in advance and waiting for them to reach the right size. The construction process was carefully organized. The keel would be laid first, establishing the ship's length and basic structure. Frames would be attached to the keel, creating the skeleton that defined the hull shape. Planks would be fitted to these frames, edge to edge in the Caravels style, creating a smooth hull surface. Every joint was carefully fitted, caulked with oakum, which are fibers soaked in tar and sometimes covered with pitch to ensure watertightness. Quality control was strict. Henry's shipyards developed standards that ensured consistency across vessels. Measurements were recorded so that successful designs could be replicated. Failed designs were analyzed to understand what went wrong. This systematic approach to improvement was centuries ahead of its time. The navigation school at Sagres was equally important. Here, pilots learned to use the astrolabe and the quadrant to measure the sun's altitude and determine latitude. They studied astronomy, learning to identify stars and understand the celestial sphere. They learned mathematics, particularly the calculations needed for navigation. They studied cartography, learning to read and create charts. But the education wasn't purely theoretical. Trainee pilots would sail on actual expeditions, learning practical seamanship under experienced captains. They would learn how to read weather signs, how to identify winds and currents, how to find safe anchorages, how to approach an unknown coast safely. This combination of theoretical knowledge and practical experience created highly skilled navigators. Henry also established a system for collecting and organizing information. Every captain who returned from a voyage would be debriefed. What had they found? What were the winds like? The currents? What landmarks could be used for navigation? Where were sources of fresh water? Where were dangerous reefs or hostile populations? This information would be compiled into sailing directions and charts that were stored in secured archives. Over time, Portuguese knowledge of the Atlantic and African coast became incredibly detailed and comprehensive. The economics of Henry's operation were carefully managed. He had access to royal funds as a Prince of Portugal, but he also used his own resources. He was Grand Master of the Order of Christ, a religious military order that had substantial wealth, and he directed much of this wealth toward exploration. Early expeditions brought back trade goods, gold, and unfortunately enslaved people that helped fund further voyages, creating a self-sustaining cycle. Security was extraordinarily tight. The information being developed at Sagres, particularly detailed charts and sailing directions, was incredibly valuable. Portugal treated this information as state secrets of the highest order. Foreigners were generally not allowed in the shipyards or navigation school unless they were specifically recruited experts who could be trusted and sworn to secrecy. Portuguese pilots who shared information with foreign powers could face severe punishment, including imprisonment or even execution for treason. Henry died in 1460, but the infrastructure he created continued to function and expand. King Afonso V and later King John II continued to support exploration and improve the maritime facilities. Additional shipyards were established in Lisbon and other ports. The Casa de Guinea, or House of Guinea, was founded in Lisbon to manage trade with Africa, and it included facilities for shipbuilding, navigation training, and chart-making. By the 1480s, Portugal had multiple sophisticated shipyards capable of building caravels and larger vessels. The shipyards in Lisbon's Ribeira district became particularly famous, producing not just ships but also all the specialized equipment needed for oceanic voyages: compasses, astrolabes, hourglasses, ropes, sails, barrels for provisions, and all the other gear required for months at sea. The organization of these shipyards was remarkably advanced. There was specialization of labor, with different workers focusing on specific tasks. Some specialized in laying keels, others in fitting frames, others in planking, others in rigging. Master shipwrights oversaw construction, ensuring quality and consistency. Apprentices learned the trade through years of hands-on training under experienced craftsmen. Testing and refinement were continuous processes. New ships would be sailed in Portuguese waters to evaluate their performance before being sent on long voyages. Modifications would be made based on these trials. Successful innovations would be incorporated into future vessels. This iterative process of design, build, test, and refine created constant improvement. The knowledge developed in these shipyards didn't stay in Portugal forever, of course. Portuguese shipwrights sometimes left to work for foreign powers, taking their expertise with them. Charts and sailing directions were occasionally stolen or sold to rival nations. Spies from other countries tried to infiltrate the shipyards to learn Portuguese secrets. But Portugal maintained a significant lead in maritime technology for decades because the knowledge was embedded in an entire system, not just in documents that could be copied or individuals who could be bribed. What Henry and his successors created was fundamentally a knowledge organization. They systematically gathered information about the oceans, analyzed it, codified it, taught it to new generations of sailors, and used it to push the boundaries of exploration further each year. This approach, treating exploration as a systematic program rather than a series of random adventures, was the real secret of Portuguese success. The shipyards were the physical manifestation of this knowledge. Every caravel that slid down the ways into the Tagus River or the Atlantic embodied decades of accumulated expertise. The optimal hull shape, discovered through trial and error. The perfect proportions for masts and sails, refined through experience. The construction techniques that ensured strength and durability. The subtle details that made the difference between a good ship and a great one. These weren't just ships. They were the cutting edge of maritime technology, representing the culmination of decades of systematic innovation. And they came from shipyards that were themselves the most advanced in the world, operating according to principles of quality control, continuous improvement, and knowledge management that wouldn't become standard in other industries until centuries later. This is the question that fascinates me most. If caravels were so effective, why didn't other European nations simply copy the design and replicate Portugal's success immediately? The answer reveals something profound about how technological advantages actually work in history. It wasn't just about the ships, it was about an entire ecosystem of knowledge, skills, infrastructure, and experience that couldn't be easily copied. Let's start with the obvious. Other nations absolutely did try to copy caravels. Spain, England, France, and other maritime powers all built vessels incorporating elements of caravel design. But here's the critical thing. Building a ship that looks like a caravel and building a ship that performs like a caravel are two completely different challenges. The first barrier was detailed design knowledge. The exact specifications for caravels were closely guarded Portuguese state secrets. How precisely should the hull be shaped? What's the optimal length-to-beam ratio for different conditions? How should the frames be spaced and angled? What angle should the masts be set at? How thick should the planking be? Portuguese shipwrights knew these details through decades of experience and continuous refinement, with measurements and proportions recorded in closely guarded documents. Foreign shipbuilders trying to replicate Caravels were essentially reverse engineering them based on external observation, without access to the detailed plans and accumulated knowledge. Even if you somehow obtained the design specifications, you needed skilled shipwrights who understood how to execute them properly. Building a caravel required precision woodworking, an intuitive understanding of how wood behaves when shaped and stressed, knowledge of which specific trees to select and how to prepare the timber, and mastery of dozens of specialized techniques that could only be learned through years of hands-on experience. Portuguese shipyards had generations of accumulated expertise, passed down from master to apprentice. Foreign shipyards trying to build their first caravels were starting from scratch, and their early attempts often had subtle flaws that compromised performance. The sailing characteristics were even harder to replicate successfully. Remember, the Latin sail configuration that made caravels so maneuverable required extremely skilled handling. Portuguese sailors had decades of collective experience with these complex rigs. They knew instinctively how to trim the sails for maximum efficiency in different wind conditions, how to execute tacking maneuvers safely and efficiently, how to handle the long, heavy yard arms in rough weather, when to reef sails in building winds, and how to adjust the rig for different points of sail. Foreign sailors trying to handle Latin-rigged ships for the first time often struggled badly, and a poorly sailed ship won't perform well, no matter how excellent its design might be on paper. Navigation knowledge represented another massive barrier to entry. Portuguese pilots possessed detailed, hard-won information about winds and currents throughout the Atlantic and along the African coast. They knew the seasonal patterns, the safest routes, where to expect storms at different times of year, where favorable winds could be found, where fresh water could be obtained, which coastal features made reliable navigation landmarks. This information, painstakingly compiled over decades into rutters and charts, was kept strictly secret. Foreign navigators attempting the same routes without this accumulated knowledge faced dramatically higher risks and often failed entirely, sometimes with catastrophic loss of ships and crews. There was also the critical infrastructure issue. Portugal had established an extensive network of trading posts and resupply stations along the African coast and later throughout the Indian Ocean basin. These posts provided Portuguese ships with safe harbors, access to fresh water and provisions, repair facilities when ships needed maintenance, intelligence about local conditions and politics, and pilots familiar with local waters. Foreign ships attempting to operate in these regions didn't have access to this support network, making their voyages exponentially more difficult, dangerous, and often impossible to sustain over time. Economic factors created powerful barriers as well. Portugal had been investing consistently in maritime exploration for decades, and early successes generated substantial profits that funded further voyages and infrastructure development. This created a powerful, virtuous cycle of investment and return, with each success generating resources for the next round of expansion. Other nations trying to break into Atlantic trade and Indian Ocean commerce had to make massive upfront investments without the benefit of established trade networks, existing relationships with local powers, or accumulated knowledge, making the ventures much riskier from a financial perspective and harder to sustain through the inevitable initial setbacks. Political factors played a significant role too. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 divided the world outside Europe between Portugal and Spain, along a meridian located 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. While other European powers didn't necessarily respect this papal-backed treaty, it did mean that Portuguese and Spanish ships operated with legal backing for their territorial claims and commercial activities, while ships from other nations were technically interlopers who could be attacked or seized with legal justification. This political reality shaped where different nations could operate effectively and profitably. Spain, it should be noted, did successfully adopt many Portuguese maritime innovations relatively quickly. Spanish shipbuilders constructed excellent caravels and developed their own variations and improvements. Spanish sailors became highly skilled oceanic navigators who accomplished remarkable feats of exploration and conquest. But Spain benefited enormously from geographic proximity to Portugal, substantial cultural and linguistic similarities, and significant cross-pollination of knowledge through intermarriage between Portuguese and Spanish royal houses, movement of skilled workers across the border, and shared participation in Iberian maritime culture. Even with all these advantages, Spain took several decades to reach Portuguese levels of maritime sophistication and global reach. England tried repeatedly to break into oceanic exploration under the Tudor monarchs, but initially struggled significantly. English ships were still designed primarily for coastal waters, North Sea conditions, and relatively short voyages. English sailors lacked experience with oceanic navigation, long-distance voyage planning, and the specific challenges of tropical sailing. It wasn't until the late 16th century, nearly 100 years after Portuguese caravels had opened the Atlantic, that English mariners like Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh, and Martin Frobisher demonstrated real proficiency in oceanic voyaging and began establishing England as a serious maritime power. France faced similar substantial challenges. French maritime tradition was strong in the Mediterranean and English Channel, but comparatively weak in the Atlantic. French attempts at oceanic exploration in the early 16th century were hampered by lack of institutional expertise and inadequate maritime infrastructure. Jacques Cartier's expeditions to Canada in the 1530s demonstrated growing French capabilities, but France didn't develop a sustained oceanic presence or successful colonial infrastructure until considerably later in the century. The Dutch became formidable maritime competitors and eventually supplanted Portugal in many Asian markets, but not until the late 16th and early 17th centuries, nearly 2 centuries after Portugal began its systematic exploration program. Dutch success came from methodically building the expertise and infrastructure that Portugal had developed earlier, combined with important innovations in ship finance, joint stock company organization, and more efficient trade practices that eventually gave them competitive advantages. There's a broader, more universal lesson here about technological diffusion that applies far beyond 15th century sailing ships. Having access to a technology, even seeing it work successfully firsthand, doesn't automatically mean you can effectively replicate it. There's often crucial tacit knowledge embedded in the practiced skills of craftsmen and operators that's essential for success, but extremely difficult to transfer through documents or even direct observation. There are complex supporting systems and infrastructures that make the technology effective in practice. There's accumulated experience that allows skilled operators to handle edge cases, unusual situations, and the inevitable problems that arise in real-world conditions. Portugal maintained its decisive maritime advantage for roughly a century after the first true caravels were built and tested. This wasn't because other nations didn't understand the value of what Portugal had achieved or didn't try vigorously to catch up. It was because catching up required not just copying a ship design or stealing some charts, but painstakingly replicating an entire sophisticated ecosystem of knowledge, skills, infrastructure, institutional organization, and accumulated experience. That process inevitably takes substantial time, and during that time, the leading power doesn't stand still, but continues to improve and refine its capabilities, maintaining and sometimes extending its lead. By the late 16th century, other European nations had largely closed the gap. Ship designs had evolved beyond pure caravels to galleons and other specialized vessels that incorporated lessons learned from Portuguese innovations but added new features suited to different purposes and conditions. English, Dutch, and French shipbuilders were producing vessels equal or superior to Portuguese ships for many purposes. The knowledge that Portugal had so carefully guarded for decades had gradually spread throughout maritime Europe through the movement of skilled workers, industrial espionage, independent innovation, and the inevitable diffusion that occurs over time. But for a critical century, roughly from 1450 to 1550, Portugal enjoyed a decisive technological and organizational advantage that allowed a remarkably tiny nation to dominate global maritime trade, control access to valuable resources and markets, and establish the world's first truly global empire. The Caravel was the most visible centerpiece of this advantage, but the advantage itself derived from a complex, sophisticated system of knowledge, skills, institutions, and organization that couldn't be easily replicated. That's the real answer to why other nations couldn't simply copy Portugal's success, at least not quickly enough to prevent Portugal from reaping enormous benefits from its century of maritime leadership. So we've journeyed together through 5 centuries of history to explore one of the most revolutionary technologies ever developed. From the seemingly impossible problem that launched Portuguese innovation, through the revolutionary integrated design of the Caravel itself, to the game-changing lateen sails that made oceanic exploration practical, to Portugal's unlikely rise from tiny peripheral kingdom to global superpower, to the incredible voyages of discovery that opened new worlds, to the military innovations that made these elegant ships devastatingly deadly, to the secret shipyards and knowledge centers where maritime science was born, and finally to the fascinating question of why this technological advantage lasted as long as it did. The Caravel wasn't just a ship, and this story isn't just about maritime technology. It was the key technology that unlocked the age of exploration and fundamentally, irreversibly changed the entire course of human history. These remarkable vessels connected continents and civilizations that had been completely separate for tens of thousands of years. They enabled trade networks that for the first time spanned the entire globe, transforming economies and societies on every continent. They demonstrated conclusively that human beings, armed with knowledge, skill, and the right tools, could venture anywhere on Earth and return to tell the tale, fundamentally changing humanity's conception of itself and its place in the world. For better and for worse, and the consequences were certainly mixed, the world we all live in today was profoundly shaped by these remarkable ships and the age of exploration they enabled. But here's what I really want to know from you, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think was the single most important factor in Portugal's extraordinary success? Was it the innovative ship design itself, with its perfect balance of size, speed, and capability? Was it the lateen sails and the ability to sail against the wind? Was it Prince Henry's organizational genius in creating the world's first research and development program? Was it the systematic approach to gathering, analyzing, and applying knowledge? Was it the fortunate timing and unique historical circumstances? Or was it something else entirely that I haven't fully captured in this analysis? And here's another question worth pondering, one with relevance to our own time. Are there modern parallels to what Portugal achieved in the 15th century? Can you think of examples from recent history where a small nation, company, or organization achieved outsized impact and influence through technological innovation combined with systematic knowledge building? How do those examples compare to the Portuguese maritime revolution? I genuinely want to hear your thoughts and perspectives on these questions. Drop a comment below sharing your analysis. And if you found this deep dive into maritime history technological innovation, and global transformation fascinating and valuable. Do me a significant favor. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss future videos where we explore the technologies, innovations, and pivotal moments that change the world. Share this video with anyone in your life who loves history, engineering, exploration, or just compelling stories about human achievement and innovation. The story of the Caravel reminds us of something we sometimes forget in our modern world, that sometimes the most profound changes in history come not from the biggest, richest, or most powerful actors, but from those who think differently, organize systematically, persist in the face of seemingly impossible challenges, and combine knowledge from diverse sources in innovative ways. Portugal's century of maritime dominance proves that innovation, accumulated knowledge, systematic organization, and determination can overcome almost any disadvantage in size, wealth, or initial position. Thank you for joining me on this voyage through history, technology, and human achievement. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking curious questions about how our world came to be the way it is. The answers, as I hope I've shown you today, are often far more fascinating, complex, and instructive than we might initially imagine. Safe travels, and I'll see you in the next video.